Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges and I'll be reviewing a truly fascinating film called Agora. Set during the last days of the Roman Empire, this is the incredible story of a very special woman called Hypatia. In a world dominated by men, she was one of the very few women considered equal amongst her peers, making her mark upon the world as a mathematician, a philosopher, and an astronomer. Her life's work was dedicated simply to the pursuit of wisdom, but she lived in a pivotal moment in time when the ancient world she knew came crashing down around her, and a new era of history was about to begin. This is Agora. For those of you who haven't seen Agora or don't know much about the real Hypatia, I feel that in order to tell her story, we would have to start with the city she lived in, Alexandria, one of the most important cities in antiquity. If Athens was the birthplace of democracy and Rome's power was built upon its military strength, then Alexandria was founded by knowledge. And it was Alexander the Great himself who envisioned it. During his conquest of the Persian Empire, he arrived in Egypt and was seen by the Egyptians not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. His open-minded approach to their religion and customs made him beloved by the natives, so much so they declared him Pharaoh, a living god on earth. However, it was Alexander's wish to make his new divine status irrefutable, and one that would last throughout the centuries. The pharaohs of old had their great pyramids. Alexander the Great wanted a city, one of many to come that would bear his name, and that city was Alexandria. Now, unlike traditional Egyptian cities which were founded up and down the Nile, Alexander wanted his to be located on the coast. And the reason for this was because Alexander wanted to look out across the Mediterranean Sea towards his homeland of Greece and Macedonia. He also wanted to make his new Egyptian capital a center for trade and commerce, which also benefited from the easy-to-access overland route linking it from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Needless to say, this city boomed from this decision, and the wealth of Asia flowed back to Greece. However, Alexander also wanted to import the knowledge of Greece and its culture, and make Alexandria the intellectual capital of his new empire. Now, although many people remember Alexander as a great general, he understood that knowledge was power, especially since he himself had been taught by the great philosopher Aristotle, who had also been taught by Plato, who in turn had been taught by Socrates, and last but not least, was a student of the two great ones.
Dust. Wind. Dude.
Alright, fine, maybe I made that last part up. But the point I'm trying to make is that these guys heavily valued independent and critical thinking, to question anything and everything, and Alexander was wise enough to know the benefits of such teachings. So years later, after the founding of Alexandria, Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. His empire would be divided and Egypt would go to his most trusted general, Ptolemy, who was also crowned pharaoh. Ptolemy would continue his predecessor's work, and schools of learning in science, medicine, astronomy, and physics began to appear throughout the city. And then Ptolemy's legacy, the world's first research center, was constructed, and that was the Great Library of Alexandria. Its goal was to seek out every book in the known world, copy it, and then store it in this library. They took it so seriously that any traveler coming into Alexandria, whether it be by land or sea, would be searched for books, and if any were found, they would be confiscated. These books would then be painstakingly copied by scribes over many generations, and because of this, these books would eventually be the only copies to survive over the years. The library would house books of science, medicine, poetry, history, philosophy, geography, astronomy, and much, much more. As you can imagine, a city harboring all the world's knowledge in one place became a very attractive location for scholars. They would move to Alexandria, use the books at the library to conduct their research, write their own pieces of work, which would then be copied and added to the library. And this continued for centuries, culminating in 500,000 to perhaps even 1,000,000 books. To give you an idea of the great thinkers who lived in Alexandria and did their research at the library, we could look at people such as Eratosthenes, who accurately calculated the circumference of the Earth. We could look at Aristarchus, who correctly theorized that the Earth revolved around the Sun nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus did. We could look at Archimedes, one of the ancient world's finest mathematicians, who refined and developed his principles of water displacement as a result of studying in Alexandria. And there were so many more examples I could give. However, one event would nearly destroy everything that the Ptolemy dynasty had preserved. It was during the reign of Queen Cleopatra when the glory of the Great Library began to fade. In 46 BC, Cleopatra was fighting a civil war with her brother Ptolemy XIII when a Roman general called Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. She was able to seduce Caesar to join her side, and together they took the fight to Ptolemy. Out of the harbour of Alexandria, though, a fierce naval battle took place, and Julius Caesar gave the order to fire his enemy's ships. Unfortunately, the fire spread from the ships to the harbour docks, and ultimately to the Great Library. Thousands of original books were destroyed in the flames, but smaller incarnations of the library survived, like the Serapeum, and were able to preserve enough of the books. Eventually, Egypt was conquered by Rome, and they also kept the tradition of the library going, but under much less enthusiasm compared to the Ptolemy dynasty. The new management meant less funding, but the scholarly spirit of Alexandria was still kept alive. But if you jump forward 400 years later, when the movie begins, and by this point the Serapeum was all that was left of the original library, and its contents need to be protected now more than ever.
This is why we have to take great care of this place. Our library is all that remains of the wisdom of man.
Hypatia was born in Alexandria towards the end of the 4th century. When exactly, we do not know. Some historians believe that it may have been at 355, whilst others argue it was around 370. In fact, most of our knowledge of her comes from the bits and pieces gathered together by historians. What we do know about her is that she was the only daughter of Theon, a Greek scholar and a mathematician, and was generally considered to be one of the most educated men in the city. They had an extremely close bond with one another, and she got from him the same love of learning. From a very early age, Hypatia became fascinated with the subjects her father taught, and she in turn became his star pupil. They would spend countless hours discussing the mysteries of the universe and debate over the possible answers. Theon wisely recognized this great passion of hers and encouraged it, especially when she began to surpass him in her studies of astronomy, astrology, mathematics, and philosophy. Eventually, it came to a point when Theon instructed Hypatia that she should also teach, which she did exceptionally well. In fact, she was loved by many of her students, and people came from all across the empire to attend her classes and learn from her.
Watch again. Watch again. No, leave it. So, what mysterious wonder do you all think might be lurking beneath the earth that would make every single person and animal and object and slave settle there? What might it be?
The heaviness, lady.
No. Synesius?
Their weightiness.
No, you're both speaking about the same thing, but you're not talking about the primary cause.
However, Hypatia lived in a time where asking these sort of questions would soon be under threat. The recently banned religion Christianity had not only been made legal for the first time in its history, but had now been adopted by the Roman emperors. The political landscape throughout the empire was beginning to shift, and religious tensions combined with age-old grudges were boiling over, and Alexandria was no exception. You have the dwindling pagans who were still powerful by this point, but they were beginning to feel their influence slipping away. And then there were the ever-growing Christian population who were resentful for the centuries of persecutions they suffered from their former masters.
If my gods eat and drink and fornicate, good for them.
Know this! You who console yourselves with pagan images, men, women, birds, reptiles, Serapis, who could trust a god with a flower pot for a crown?
Oh, you Christians, how arrogant you've become now that the empire allows you to exist. My father's father saw them slaughtered in the circus and fed to the lions.
Religious confrontations such as these were growing in frequency, and throughout all walks of life. Even Hypatia's classes must have seen evidence of this, as she taught both Christians and pagans. Even though they were more enlightened than the general public, it was still a hot-button issue. However, Hypatia would try to convince her students to rise above such trivialities.
Now, are you both not similar to me?
Yes.
And you, Orestes?
Yes.
Now, I am actually saying this to everybody here in this room. More things unite us than divide us. Now, whatever may be going on in the streets, we are brothers. We are brothers.
In credit to this movie, I can totally buy that Hypatia would say something like this, since she was not a Christian, but she was also not necessarily a pagan either. She was a Neoplatonist, and that was a philosophy that believed that in order to achieve a union with the divine or the universe, the best way of attaining that was to disregard the world's distractions and to focus on meditating, studying, and basically just to live a good life. But such enlightened thinking was mostly held by the privileged few. Out in the streets, tensions had reached their breaking point. Pagans were outraged to discover that the statues of their gods were being mocked and desecrated by a mob of Christians. Seeking retribution, the pagans armed themselves and attacked.
What madness is this?
The streets ran with Christian blood, but the pagans soon discovered that they had greatly underestimated their size and ferocity. The Christians counterattacked in much greater numbers, forcing the pagans to flee. They retreated to the Serapeum with Christian hostages and barred the doors. The angry mob was close to breaking their way in when Roman soldiers arrived and defended the entrance. With the pagans barricaded inside and the Christians refusing to leave, the riot had now turned into a siege. Some time passed as word of this reached the Emperor Theodosius, and I'm sure that the pagans were really nervous that their lives were in the hands of a Christian emperor, one who had been actively abolishing pagan practices for some time. Eventually, he sent word back to the governor of Alexandria what his decree would be. He stated that the pagans who were responsible for the riot would be pardoned and would be allowed to leave with their lives. The film quite appropriately shows them cheering over this bit of good news, as I'm sure many of them thought they could hardly believe their luck, since the emperor was hardly sympathetic to his pagan subjects. That was until the prefect read the rest of the letter.
The insurgents will abandon the Serapeum and the library immediately, allowing the Christians to enter and dispose of the premises as they see fit.
So, with nothing holding back the mob, they burst into the Serapeum en masse. Now, why did Theodosius do this? Well, besides the library, within the walls of the Serapeum was a temple to the god Serapis. And around this time was when Theodosius really started putting into effect his war against paganism. Throughout the entire empire, he would either allow or authorize the destruction of many pagan sites. Just like you're seeing here. Centuries of history and culture disappearing within his reign. The temple of Serapis was completely destroyed, but the true loss came when the Christians descended upon the library and tore it apart. Now, I must say that even though the contents of this library was much smaller in size compared to the glory of the original one, its loss cannot be understated, since it's quite possible that this was all that remained of the great library of Alexandria. Shortly after, paganism was officially abolished, and Christianity had become the new dominant power. Now, the movie jumps forward in time, but it doesn't say how much exactly. By the events you're about to see in this review, this would have been around 415, and a lot of stuff has happened since the destruction of the Serapeum. If I was in Hypatia's shoes, it would have looked like the end of the world to me. The last bastion to the wisdom of the ancient world was gone. Almost all of the pagans had either converted or fled Alexandria, and any who were left were much weaker as a result. The empire had divided, and the once mighty city of Rome had been sacked by barbarians only 5 years before, which shocked the Roman world since it had been the first time in 800 years. In spite of all of this, Hypatia continued to teach and was still considered a very honourable and influential woman in the city, with many friends in high places such as the new prefect Orestes. In the movie, their friendship is based on the fact that he used to be one of her students. However, I have been unable to find any evidence of this, and it seems to me that their relationship was more likely politically driven, that Orestes wished to use her influence to garner support for his administration. And he definitely needed all the help he could get, as there was a new wave of religious fundamentalism sweeping the city. This was from a powerful order of monks called the Parabolani, who were led by the new bishop of Alexandria called Cyril. In his new position, Cyril sought temporal as well as spiritual power amongst his Christian followers. Basically, he was the real-world equivalent of the High Sparrow from Game of Thrones. The one thing blocking his path to total power was Orestes, who had the support of the city elite, like Hypatia, and the Jews. And during all of this were frequent and violent confrontations between the Parabolani and the Jews.
Damn Jews!
They're just a bunch of good-for-nothing thugs! Pack animals!
Joran, my dear friend, calm down. Let Bishop Cyril speak in his own defense.
Prefect, our blessed Parabolani, whom he has just called beasts of burden, devote themselves, true enough, to carrying burdens. Crippled, the sick, the lepers.
And stones! Prefect, they carry stones. And now they burst into the theatre, and they stone us, knowing we will do nothing to defend ourselves because it is the Sabbath!
On the Sabbath, you should honor God in your synagogues instead of stuffing yourselves with sweets at the theatre. That is why the stones fell upon you.
The hostilities between the two groups would continue, and eventually led to the Jews laying out a trap, crying out that the church of St. Alexander was burning. The Christians ran into the church to put the fire out, but were instead attacked by the Jews, and many were killed. Cyril, furious by what the Jews had done, called out for their exile and demanded an immediate retaliation against them. A mob of Christians led by Cyril attacked the Jewish quarter, slaughtering many in their path. As to how many people died in the chaos, I can't fully say. Enough at least to convince most of the Jewish population to flee the city in fear. Cyril had played his hand well, and now Orestes had lost his biggest group of supporters. All he had left were the city elite, and of course, Hypatia.
Where are the troops? Why are there no more soldiers on the streets?
No army could contain that mob. The entire city is in a frenzy. He is calling for the annihilation of women and children. A bishop, a Christian.
Then lock him up!
Unfortunately, Orestes came to the conclusion that he couldn't do that. His fear is that he would ostracize the large Christian following Cyril had, and in doing so, risk an all-out uprising. Orestes' power and influence was slipping away. He accepted counsel from his most trusted advisor, which was Hypatia. And Cyril recognized the threat she posed to his authority and made his final move against Orestes. In public, he declared the philosopher Hypatia to be a witch, and the instruments she used for astronomy, like the astrolabe, were tools of the devil to see into the future. That her grip into Orestes was work of powerful black magic. Riled up by superstition, an angry mob of Cyril's supporters searched the streets for Hypatia. They found her on her way to work and pulled her off her chariot, taking her to a newly converted church and stripped her naked. Now in the movie, one of the Christians, Davus, who used to be her slave, and because of his love for his former mistress, he kills her by smothering her. Unfortunately, Davus is a fictional character, and her real death was not as peaceful. The Parabolani grabbed bits of broken roof tiles and pottery and flayed her alive. After suffering a very painful death, they cut off her limbs and burnt them. With Hypatia out of the way, Orestes resigned shortly afterwards, allowing Cyril to gain total authority over Alexandria. Later, he was declared a saint. If science ever had a martyr, it was Hypatia. At the risk of her own life, she refused to be swayed by these mindless fanatics and carried on doing what she loved, and that was teaching, in pursuing science, mathematics, and philosophy as the world around her tore itself apart. She remained true to her beliefs, right up until the very end.
Years ago, you taught us something. If two are equal to a third, they are all equal to each other. Do you remember?
Yes.
The three of us, we are all good people, and you are as Christian as we are.
Dionysius, you don't question what you believe. You cannot. I must.
Agora is one of those movies that flew completely under my radar, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of you haven't even heard of it until now. This is a film I immensely enjoyed, and it covers a period of history that not many people know about. And I believe that this is a film that needs to be watched. Now, normally when I do these reviews I point out inaccuracies and I inform you how close the film got to the source material, but ironically, it's going to be difficult since very little information has survived today. And it's because of stupid shit like this. Now, there are some things we do know, like for example that Hypatia was probably in her 50s or 60s around the time of her death, meaning that the lovely Rachel Weisz is too young to play Hypatia in the second half of the film, but it's not really a big deal to me. Another thing about Hypatia was that she was better known for her work in mathematics and geometry, but the film is justified in showing her passion for astronomy, as there are records of her working on instruments like the astrolabe, which was a device that located the position of the stars and planets and telling you what time it was and etc. As to what she exactly worked on remains a mystery, unfortunately, but it does allow the film to be creative here. Probably the biggest plot point in the entire film for Hypatia is when she's trying to disprove the accepted Ptolemaic system, which stated that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around it.
Earth is the center of the cosmos. And revolving around it, the Sun and the five wanderers, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, obstinately disobeying the law of the circle. Nevertheless, Ptolemy shows us that they do obey it. The fact that we see them move in a loop is due to the joint effect of two circles. One that travels around the Earth, and another lesser circle, proper to each wanderer.
This is of course completely wrong, and Hypatia is the one who asks why it's so needlessly complicated and surely there is a simple answer. Then she considers the theory Aristarchus had of the Earth revolving around the Sun along with the other planets, which is known as the heliocentric system. Over the course of the film she tries to prove this theory, but keeps on coming up short, since the consensus at the time was that the planets only orbit in a circle. And then towards the end of the film, Hypatia finally figures out the answer.
An ellipse! With the sun at one of its foci. Because what is a circle? Except a very special ellipse, whose foci have drawn so close together that they appear to be one. But perhaps I'm completely raving. Vespasius, I mean, really, why should this be so? Maybe I'm...
This is the tragic part of the film, because we see Hypatia correctly figure out the answer, only to die shortly afterwards, taking this theory to her grave. Now, there is no evidence at all that Hypatia ever worked on the heliocentric system, but there is no way to prove or disprove this since hardly any of her work has survived. So, the movie is trying to make a point here and is asking, what if she had? What if she figured out the answer 1200 years before Johannes Kepler did? Questions such as these are seen to be quite controversial, especially because of the answers depicted in the movie. When Agora came out, let's just say it wasn't received very well by Christians.
The presentation of it as a battle between science and sweet reason on the one hand, and this sort of hysterical, primitive, superstitious Christianity on the other hand is just for the birds.
Personally, I feel criticisms such as these are unwarranted. I didn't walk away from this film thinking that it was about science versus Christianity. Throughout the film we see pagans, Jews, and Christians committing horrific acts. In my opinion, I think this film is discussing the dangers of fundamentalism and how religion can and does inspire it. Fanatical destruction that we see with the library can also be seen today, like how ISIS is destroying temples and archaeological sites simply because of their twisted interpretation of Islam. But you know what? I'm going to go even further with this and just tell it like it is. Christians back then were not like Christians today. There was a general hostility towards classical learning, and anything acquainted with paganism or the old world order had no place with the church's teachings. And so classical Greek and Roman literature would be rejected by choice. Don't take my word for it though. Here's a quote from Roman period Christian apologist called Tertullian. "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Our instruction comes from the porch of Solomon, who had himself taught that the Lord should be sought in simplicity of heart. Away with all attempts to produce a model Christianity of Stoic, Platonic, and dialectic composition. We want no curious disputation after possessing Christ Jesus, no inquisition after enjoying the gospel. With our faith, we desire no further belief." So if the Christians depicted in the movie are ignorant, it's because their historical counterparts chose to be. They made an actual effort to eradicate pagan thought and practice in order to replace it with a new belief system. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, the church would be the sole institution in the Western world. For 800 years, their teachings were God's teachings, and anything else contradicting it was heresy. This period in time would be called the Dark Ages. And what were the consequences of such a radical step backwards in human development? Well, with so much lost, it's impossible to say. Many historians speculate that our civilization would be far more advanced than it is today. A single great example of this would be the work of a Greek inventor who lived in Alexandria called Herod. What you're seeing is one of his inventions, the world's first steam turbine engine. This device had harnessed the power of steam nearly 2,000 years before James Watt changed the world with his. Although Herod and his successors didn't see its full potential at the time, what if some other inventor centuries later had? What if science wasn't seen as heresy and was encouraged like in the glory days of Alexandria? What kind of a world would we live in today? Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know in the comment section what you thought about Agora. And of course, what historical movie should I review next? In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.